In the tiny town of Ridgemore, population 311, life moved at the pace of a heartbeat right before it stops. Everyone knew each other, and secrets were supposedly non-existent. But if you paid close enough attention, you'd sense the town was hiding something. A quiet but deeply unsettling presence hanging over every street, every home, and every gaze. Eric had moved to Ridgemore a month earlier, renting a creaky two-bedroom house on the edge of town, where the forest crept up close and seemed to watch him. He'd recently lost his job in the city and thought the change of scenery might be therapeutic, a chance to reset. His first few days were uneventful but oddly tense. People looked at him longer than usual, almost wary, and he felt like every step he took left an echo that carried secrets. One night, Eric stopped by the town's only bar, an old brick establishment named the Red Lantern. Inside, it was dimly lit and smelled of stale beer. A few locals sat scattered around, all sipping drinks in silence. When he entered, everyone turned to look at him, and for a second, a flicker of something like recognition passed over their faces. He shrugged it off, blaming small-town gossip. A gray-haired man with sunken eyes at the bar waved him over. "You're the newcomer, huh?" he asked, with a tone more accusatory than welcoming. "Yep, that's me," Eric replied, putting on a polite smile. "Name's Eric." The man looked at him for a moment and then asked, "Do you feel it?" "Feel what?" "The hush," the man whispered almost fearfully. Eric laughed nervously. "What do you mean by that?" The man's gaze became distant. "You'll understand soon enough." Eric left the bar that night with a strange feeling lodged deep in his gut. As he walked home along the empty lamplit streets, he felt as though he were being watched. The wind picked up, carrying an eerie, faint whistling that almost sounded like whispers. The following day, Eric ran into his neighbor, Mrs. Jansen, a woman in her late 60s. She was friendly but reserved, keeping her distance even as she smiled. He asked her casually, "Mrs. Jansen, have you ever felt like something's not right here?" Her face went still, and she looked at him with haunted eyes. "Just keep to yourself, Eric. Don't go looking." Her words sat with him, weighing heavy on his mind. But curiosity got the better of him. Over the next few days, he began asking around, but every inquiry was met with blank stares, vague answers, and veiled warnings to mind his own business. One evening, he found himself wandering the edge of town, drawn toward the dark thicket of forest just beyond the old church. He'd heard children whispering about the clearing, but whenever he'd asked anyone about it, they would clam up instantly, muttering superstitions. In the darkening twilight, he made his way through the trees, feeling the chill in the air grow sharper. After walking for nearly an hour, he stumbled upon it, a circular patch in the woods, where the trees grew in an unnatural ring. The ground felt different beneath his feet, soft and almost pulsing like a weak heartbeat. At the center of the clearing, he found a small mound of disturbed earth. Curious, he dug a little with his hands, uncovering what looked like a crude marker, a single wooden stake with initials scratched into it, EB. A chill ran down his spine as he stared at the initials, wondering why they looked familiar. As he knelt there, he heard a rustling behind him and turned to see the gray-haired man from the bar. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice low and shaking. "You were supposed to leave it alone." Eric stumbled back, fear blooming in his chest. "What is this place?" The man looked at him, pity and horror mingling on his face. "It's a reminder. You see, Eric, every soul who comes to Ridgemore has been here before." Eric frowned. "What are you talking about?" The man took a deep breath, looking up at the darkening sky. "Some towns are cursed to repeat. Those who die here come back again, over and over, never remembering the last time. But the land remembers, and sometimes it tries to warn you." He pointed at the initials on the stake. "Eric Benson. That's your name, isn't it?" A wave of nausea overtook him as he stared at the initials. Memories flashed in his mind, fragmented but familiar, a sense of déjà vu he couldn't explain. He remembered faces, voices, pain. Suddenly, he was flooded with images of himself in this very clearing, hearing the same warning. Each time he'd ignored it. "You're trapped here," the man continued, his voice filled with sorrow. "Just like all of us." Eric's mind reeled as the forest seemed to close in, suffocating him. He was stuck here, destined to relive this cycle endlessly, forever haunted by a town that never truly let anyone leave. As he staggered back toward his house, his memories began to fade, slipping through his mind like sand through fingers. By the time he reached his door, he was blank, only vaguely aware of a strange unease. And the next day, he found himself wandering again, a restless newcomer in a quiet, unnerving town. He'd soon find himself at the clearing once more, staring at the marker with the initials EB engraved on it, never remembering and never leaving. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, tucked away from prying eyes, lay the town of Roan's Hollow. Roan's Hollow was a town of shadows and secrets, and even the locals couldn't tell you its exact founding date. The only thing they knew was that every year without fail, the town held a festival known as the Gathering of Lights. Outsiders weren't allowed, and any stranger who came into town around that time would be met with a polite but firm message: turn back. Amelia, a travel writer, found herself stranded near Roan's Hollow just days before the festival. She'd been driving through the mountains trying to get photos of lesser-known places when a fallen tree blocked the winding road. With no way around it and no cell service, she had no choice but to hike back to the town she'd passed a few miles back. By the time she made it to Roan's Hollow, the sky was already dark and only a handful of lights twinkled in the distance. She was greeted by a few wary, watchful faces that seemed reluctant to offer help. Finally, a woman named Maeve, with hollow cheeks and nervous eyes, offered Amelia a room in her small home on the edge of town. As they made polite small talk, Amelia could sense Maeve's unease, though she couldn't put her finger on why. "Festival's in 2 days," Maeve said softly as she poured Amelia some tea. "You should leave before then." Amelia chuckled, assuming it was some local superstition, but Maeve's expression remained tense. "Why? What's the festival about?" Maeve's hands trembled slightly as she placed the teacup in front of Amelia. "It's a tradition, that's all. We light the lanterns, march through town, and offer something to the mountain. It keeps us safe." "Safe from what?" Maeve looked out the window, her gaze distant. "From whatever else is out there." Amelia felt a shiver run down her spine, but curiosity got the better of her. She wanted to learn more. Despite Maeve's quiet warnings, Amelia spent the next day wandering the town, trying to piece together what this festival was really about. Everyone she spoke to gave her vague answers, and the air grew colder as evening approached. That night, Amelia noticed something strange. Around midnight, a single lantern floated down the street, carried by an unseen hand. She crept outside to get a closer look and saw that every home had a lantern sitting by the door, swaying in the breeze. The town was filled with these floating lights, casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets. She felt a deep, almost primal fear as the lanterns seemed to lead her to the town center, where a small crowd had gathered. At the center of the gathering stood a young man, bound at the wrists and looking terrified. His face was pale, and his eyes darted around, silently pleading with anyone who would look back. The townsfolk stood in a circle around him, their faces blank but resigned, like they were performing some dreadful duty. Maeve spotted Amelia and rushed over, panic evident in her eyes. "I told you to stay inside. What are they doing?" Amelia whispered, her voice shaking. Maeve grabbed her arm, whispering harshly, "If they see you, they'll take you too." Amelia tried to pull away, confused and horrified. "Take me for what?" Just then, a man at the front of the crowd began to speak, his voice booming and filled with a solemnity that chilled her. "The mountain calls for a life to keep the rest of us safe. We honor this pact every year, as it has always been. So tonight, we offer you, Marcus." Amelia watched in horror as the townspeople began chanting, a low, rhythmic sound that grew louder with each passing second. The young man's eyes met hers, wide with terror. Before she could make sense of what was happening, Maeve pulled her away, dragging her back to the house. Amelia spent the night in a state of shock, her mind racing. She'd heard of strange rituals in small towns before, but this felt ancient, raw, as if the very land demanded a price. The following day, Amelia confronted Maeve, desperate for answers. Maeve looked at her with pity, sadness darkening her face. "Long ago, this town made a pact with something in the mountain. Every year we give it one of our own to keep the rest of us safe. It's been that way as long as anyone can remember. And if we don't..." Maeve trailed off, but her haunted expression said enough. Amelia's hands trembled as she asked, "Why don't you just leave? Why stay here?" Maeve looked out the window, her voice a whisper. "It doesn't let us leave either." Amelia's blood ran cold. She remembered the fallen tree that had blocked her path, forcing her back toward the town. She tried to convince herself it was a coincidence, but Maeve's gaze told her otherwise. The day of the festival arrived, and as night fell, the townsfolk gathered in the square once more. Amelia stayed hidden, too afraid to even glance out the window, but as the chanting began, she felt a strange compulsion to watch. She peeked outside, her heart racing. This time, the townspeople were lighting lanterns and placing them on the edge of town like a boundary. Then, in the flickering light, she saw the shape, a massive shadow, slithering down from the mountain, moving in unnatural fluid patterns. It was a shifting mass, like smoke, but with twisted limbs that scraped against the earth, leaving deep gouges in the ground. Its eyes, if that's what they were, gleamed with a sickly, unnatural glow. The townsfolk chanted louder, their voices mingling with the howling wind as the creature moved closer, its form towering over the trembling town. It stopped at the edge, where the lanterns burned bright, flickering like stars. The creature paused, as if testing the boundary, before it let out a guttural, bone-chilling wail that echoed through the mountains. After what felt like an eternity, the creature began to retreat, sliding back up the mountain. When it finally disappeared into the shadows, the townsfolk breathed a collective sigh of relief. The lanterns dimmed one by one, and silence settled over Roan's Hollow. The next morning, Amelia tried to leave, desperate to escape. But no matter which road she took, she found herself back in town. It was as if the mountain itself wouldn't let her go. That evening, Maeve came to her door, her face filled with sorrow. "You're one of us now, Amelia. You'll be here next year, for the festival." As the realization set in, Amelia felt her mind slipping, her last bit of hope dying. She was trapped in Roan's Hollow, bound to the mountain's insatiable hunger, destined to be one of the lights guiding the creature back to the darkness. Cedar Pines was a little town barely visible on any map, nestled in the heart of endless woods. Locals called it the town where time stood still because people there lived as if the rest of the world didn't exist. Generations rarely moved away. They were born, lived, and died there, carrying on traditions that no one could remember the origins of. It was as if Cedar Pines existed in its own bubble, untouched by time or progress. Kara wasn't from Cedar Pines. She was a traveling nurse, used to short stints in isolated places, but something about Cedar Pines had her on edge from the start. The people she met during her rounds were odd. They stared too long, spoke in whispers, and were endlessly polite but somehow distant, as if they could see right through her. She chalked it up to small-town life and tried not to think much of it. One evening, she was assigned a late-night shift to care for Mrs. Carver, an elderly woman whose house sat on the edge of the woods. Mrs. Carver was frail, barely coherent, but there was a strange alertness in her eyes. As Kara checked her vitals, Mrs. Carver's hand shot out, gripping Kara's wrist with surprising strength. "Beware the shadow people," she rasped, her eyes wide with terror. Kara froze, trying to pull her hand away gently. "It's okay, Mrs. Carver. You're safe." No. Mrs. Carver's voice was trembling. "They're always here, watching, when it's quiet. You'll see." She let go, sinking back into her pillow, muttering about shadows that don't belong. Uneasy, Kara finished her work and headed home, unable to shake the strange encounter. On her way back, she noticed the woods seemed different. The trees were darker, almost as if they were absorbing the last bits of light. She felt a chill despite the warm night air, a sensation like eyes pressing down on her from all sides. That night, sleep didn't come easy. She lay awake, listening to the silence until a faint tapping noise began to echo from her window. She brushed it off as a branch, but the sound persisted, growing louder, more deliberate. Finally, she got up and looked out into the night. Nothing. Just the empty, silent street. Relieved, she turned back to bed when her eyes caught something moving in the reflection of her mirror. Just a flicker, like a shadow slipping past her door. She spun around, heart pounding, but again, nothing was there. The next day, she asked a few people around town if they had ever experienced strange shadows or noises. They looked at her with stony expressions, dismissing her concerns with half-hearted smiles. But their eyes told a different story. They knew something. A few of them exchanged glances, murmuring to each other, and she overheard one word: hushed. That night, as she prepared to go to sleep, she heard the tapping again, a steady, rhythmic sound. But this time it was louder, as if something were deliberately trying to get her attention. She lay there, paralyzed, feeling a presence in her room. Finally, unable to bear it, she turned on the lamp and bolted upright. And there it was. A shadow, tall, thin, its edges blurry as if it were struggling to hold its shape. It stood by her door, featureless, watching her with an intensity that felt almost physical, pinning her to her bed. She stared, unable to breathe, feeling the air in the room grow thick and cold. Her eyes darted around, searching for any escape, but the shadow didn't move. It just stood there, as if waiting. Finally, she managed to whisper, "What do you want?" The shadow tilted its head, and a whisper filled the room like wind through leaves, but she could make out words within it. "You don't belong." Kara clenched her fists, willing herself to move, to wake up from what had to be a nightmare. But she was frozen in place, feeling her chest tighten, as if the shadow was pulling the air out of her lungs. Just when she thought she would pass out, the shadow faded, sinking back into the darkness, leaving her room eerily silent. She barely slept that night, haunted by the shadow's words. She didn't belong, it had said. But why? What did it mean? The next morning, she visited the library, hoping to find some explanation. Cedar Pine's library was dusty and cramped, its shelves filled with books that looked untouched for decades. She sifted through local histories, combing through any information she could find about strange occurrences or legends, until finally she found a slim volume with a faded cover titled The Lost of Cedar Pines. The book contained stories of people who had come to Cedar Pines only to disappear shortly after. It spoke of travelers, visitors, even people passing through, who vanished without a trace. Yeah, the townsfolk had a name for it, the cleansing. According to the book, Cedar Pines had rules, ancient and unspoken, that kept its people safe. Those who disrupted that balance, who didn't belong, were taken. A chill ran through her as she flipped to the last page. It was a crude drawing, a shadowy figure with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. Below it, someone had written, "The town watches, the shadows cleanse." Kara closed the book, her hands shaking. She'd heard of superstitions, sure, but this felt different. It was as if the town itself was enforcing these rules, as if it were alive and aware of her presence. As she left the library, she noticed a small group of locals gathered nearby, their eyes following her intently. They whispered to each other, their expressions grim. She realized then that they knew she'd seen the shadow. They knew what would happen to her. That night, she locked every door and window, double-checking each lock, praying it would keep whatever was out there at bay. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't matter. The tapping began around midnight, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. Then came the whispers, filling her room like a cold wind. She clutched her blanket, squeezing her eyes shut. "Kara?" The voice was faint but unmistakable, echoing in the silence. She opened her eyes, and there it was again, the shadow standing by her bed. But this time it wasn't alone. The room was filled with figures, more shadows, all staring at her, surrounding her bed. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The shadows moved closer, their dark, featureless faces bending toward her, filling her vision until all she could see was blackness. The next day, her supervisor arrived to check on her after she missed her shift. The house was empty, as if she'd vanished without a trace. Her things were still there, her bed untouched, but Kara was gone. The locals said nothing, only exchanging quiet, knowing glances, as if they'd seen this happen before. In the days that followed, people in town would occasionally feel a chill, a fleeting presence, like someone watching from the shadows. Some claimed they heard whispers late at night, soft voices calling out a name that faded into the dark. And so, Cedar Pines remained as it always had, untouched, undisturbed, with a new shadow added to its collection.